Gail, do you want to start?
Well, unless anybody else wants to, yeah.
Well, I think go for it, Gail. You get first dibs.
Okay. Oh, I don't know how anybody else is feeling after that, but ooh, you know.
Are you ready, Matt? You all right?
Yeah, probably.
So, yeah.
I guess there was a couple of really strong things for me. And to pick the first one, we could do the second one another time. One obviously is the non-violence thing, which I think would be up for a lot of people here. I'm sort of thinking about how I read Nelson Mandela's biography, and he got to a point of going, look, we've absolutely tried everything, and that's what I'm doing now, you know, and I absolutely honour that choice. And I suppose, as somebody who's thinking about becoming a Quaker, I suppose where I'm at with it, sometimes I kind of think if this is the best that we can manage as a civilization, destroying ourselves, then on some level I accept that. That's a very painful thing to say. I don't say that lightly, but I kind of yeah, I think that's where I'm at with it really. And part two would be to say I think there are other much more effective things that we could try, and I have a proposal around it that I'd like to discuss. So it's not to give up, do you know what I mean? But on that point of would I point a gun at somebody and shoot them, you know, where am I at with that personally? I think maybe I kind of do, I'm borderline pacifist. So it's more of a comment really, because I just wonder how everybody else is feeling about that particular thing. And I guess I also feel like, you know, if somebody's actually coming to poison your own children, I'd fucking take their face off, you know. I mean, it's where do you draw the line at when people's actions are impinging on you? So I'm not, I'm just kind of saying how I feel about it more than anything, I think.
Yeah, I think that sometimes people see that section of the film to be promoting violence, and that's not particularly the case. I think the problem is that we don't really talk about things that go beyond what's accepted, right? And even if it's in the theoretical, I think that's still legal, right? And I think it's more about winning and about not letting certain sort of dogmatic ideas block us from achieving that victory. So if nonviolent civil disobedience is the thing that's going to bring us to victory, it's a tactic that is going to work within our strategy, then that's what should be used. But sometimes that's not enough. But I also think that a lot of things get conflated as violence when they're actually not. And I think part of the reason is that one is that our language is very limiting. Violence it's a word that gets used to describe a whole slew of different activities. But for instance, property doesn't feel pain. So when people sabotage a coal-fired power plant, I don't consider that violence. When people smash a window, I don't consider that violence, right? But I think you really nailed it when you said, you know, if it came down to my children, you know, I would do whatever it takes to stop that. And so for a lot of people, it's really hard to accept militant resistance. I think mostly in the first world because we don't have a connection to nature like a lot of other peoples do. And for a lot of people, like that Mohawk woman in the film, nature is their mother. And so if they treat nature like their mother, and somebody's raping their mother, then I think most of us here would react in a very defensive way, you know, and use violence if necessary to stop the raping of our mother. And I think that a lot of us understand theoretically that nature is primary, but I think, since many people, and myself included, have lived most of their lives in cities, we don't have that deep connection to nature. So our defense of nature is not as urgent as people who actually live on the land.
In my hometown, they started building what do you call it? I don't know, factory complex on the field I used to play in. I was a real goody two-shoes little girl when I was younger, and I went in and I turned this place over, you know, I was so poor, and I was about 8 or 9 years old. I don't know if it's true to say, I mean, I'm saying it's a hopeful way, I think people do have a connection. Maybe it's because we're separated, you don't see it. You know, I'm not seeing anybody cutting a tree down, but when they're trying to cut the trees down in Stroud, just opposite my house, people got in those trees, and were you there? Were you one of them?
I didn't get in the trees.
You know, when it's on your doorstep, I think that's part of the problem. It's not on, some of this stuff's not on our doorstep, is it? It's this bit we're in.
I think, sorry, I don't want to not let Frank answer, but I think there's another thing, which is that, yeah, when it's not on your doorstep, you don't maybe feel like you want to do it. And lots of us, it feels really quite wrong to think of doing things like people do when it is on their doorstep. But we should at least refrain from criticising people when they do those things on their doorstep that stop this, even if those things are unappealing to us. And sadly, that doesn't happen in a lot of the environmental movement. And I think that this is another interesting comparison with Gandhi, because even though Gandhi pushed a different model, but you know, the film talks about that, so I won't talk about it, he refused to condemn people who used stronger tactics. And similarly, Martin Luther King didn't condemn Malcolm X for a lot of what Malcolm X said. And I think that the problem we have in this country is that, like, when someone in Mexico takes up arms in Chiapas, there's a few shots of Zapatistas in there where it's not, doesn't mention it as Zapatistas. So they're protecting this area of Mexico through armed resistance. Lots of people in anti-capitalist struggles have gone, yeah, that's great, they've done that and we'll support them. But then there's been this weird silence from those of other people, because it's like, oh, well, they've taken up arms and maybe we can't support that. And it's, I think that if people who argue that maybe we need more than non-violent action are prepared to say, yeah, we support a diversity of tactics, you do whatever you want, you do all the things you think are useful, it's incumbent on the people on the other side of that to be supportive of the diversity of tactics as well, and say, well, I personally am going to be non-violent, that's my personal position. But I'm going to say, yeah, fine, you take a bit more strong action because I can see why you think that's necessary. Yeah.
That's an interesting concept of non-violence for me, in a way, which is saying, I will personally be non-violent, but I would support you being violent. I'm just trying to get my head.
I'm not saying I support it, but not condemn it. So I can see why you've taken your choice, I've taken my choice, but I'm not going to try and impose my moral stance on you. That's a better position of non-violence to me, because otherwise you're imposing your view on someone else.
I think it's also important to recognize that our lifestyles in first world nations rely on violence done to people in third world nations. And our inaction at stopping that violence, it's in itself violent. So just by simply existing here and saying, like, well, I'm going to be non-violent, I'm going to do nothing, you're still allowing that destruction and that violence to be done on people who might not have the resources to defend themselves. And so, you know, this whole mess that we're in is totally global. And so us here in the first world have a really awesome and tremendous opportunity to do away with this system and really, you know, honor the people who have been carrying, you know, our lifestyles on their back for, you know, decades, if not hundreds of years, if you consider colonization. And I think that the situation right now is so dire in terms of ecological destruction, not to mention the violence that's done to people, that we really have to up the ante. You know, this has to be the thing that we work on, whether it is preparing your town to be more local. I think that's amazingly important. But also supporting, you know, building this culture of resistance, where resistance runs through our veins, so where we support those who decide to take more radical action, and unite behind, you know, this idea that if we want to have clean air and clean water, and, you know, not let global warming get to positive feedback loops and tipping points, then we need to work on this as much as possible. It can't really just be like something we do on the side. It can't just be a hobby. Like, our lives depend on it.
Does anyone else got a question.
Sorry.
No, it's no. No, go on, Phil.
All right, what I was thinking was, I struggle a little bit with the exactly what form that resistance would take to be effective against the corporate power. I think very often we focus about fighting political power, and that's not where the real power is anymore. It sits in the corporations, and you can't easily get at them even with a violent resistance. I don't think there's really any examples where that has done. The heads of the corporations are replaceable. One area maybe where there has been some impact, but it's very divisive within the Green Movement, is animal rights activists and some of their actions against companies involved with animal experimentation and things. So what I was thinking was, if we're really talking about collapsing civilization, isn't it what we ought to be doing is supporting the bankers and deregulation and voting for the Tea Party and the ultra-right-wing organisations who are going to dismantle all the regulation of the financial system, because we very nearly collapsed civilization a couple of years ago. You know, we, as in collectively, and it was stopped. Now the governments are basically bankrupt. We can't bail it out again. If you want to crash civilization, it almost certainly is going to happen. At least to a degree that will cause recession and depression and degrowth, which in turn actually reduces carbon emissions, etc.
Yeah, I mean,
Yet we don't. We all fight against that, and so you ought to be regulating the financial system to keep it going. Do we have to question why we would want to keep it going when actually it's that economic system that drives all the rest of this stuff? And the only way to change the rules is to change the rules of the economic system.
I think that's like the hope of many people, is that the system collapses on itself. And it's certainly heading in that direction, but when, you know, we really can't say for certain. And I put this section in the film about the tar sands as just one example of what happened.